Hey, hi, hello, another week. Digital notebook vocab section, you're going to add 6 rows now by hitting that tab button, 6 of them. All right, let's do it. So, extra nerdy edition this week, we're going to get into some of those subgenres of sci-fi. This is an image courtesy of Matt Smith, our resident sci-fi writer, with a few different breakdowns underneath the umbrella of sci-fi. Remember, I've got that poster in my classroom if you want to go really deep into kind of the origins and evolution and different styles that come out of sci-fi, but we're just going to focus in on a few different ones for today. So, our first that we're going to look at is this concept of Afrofuturism. Now, you might actually know a little bit more about Afrofuturism than you think you do because you just watched in your inquiry class an Afrofuturistic story, which is Black Panther. So let's take a look at the definition, then I'll show you a couple of related images. So, Afrofuturism is a cultural movement that uses the frame of science fiction and fantasy to reimagine the history of the African diaspora and to invoke a vision of a technically advanced and generally hopeful future in which Black people thrive. So, especially as we leave Black History Month and we continue on in the world, it's important that we're focusing not just on history but also on Black future. And that's what Afrofuturism does within sci fi, is to imagine a world where Black folks are thriving. What might that look like? So you see in Wakanda, right, there's vibranium. There's all sorts of Octavia Butler is a fantastic writer. We've looked a little bit at some of her stuff. Kindred, we read a little excerpt from. But can you go ahead and write down our term and definition for Afrofuturism now? All right, got a couple of punks coming at you next. Cyberpunk, steampunk, and solar punk. And maybe you've heard some of these before. So let's take a look at cyberpunk first. So cyberpunk is a genre of science fiction set in a lawless subculture of an oppressive society dominated by computer technology. I want you to think about like the Matrix, right? I'll show you another image here as well. So where Afrofuturism is what we might even think of as like a utopia or have some utopic elements. There's some hope, Black people are thriving. Cyberpunk is very much in like a dystopia sort of place. And it also has to very much do with like technology, perhaps like oppressive technology. Now take that concept and backdate it a little bit, and we're going to talk about steampunk. Another term for steampunk is Victorian futurism. This is a genre of science fiction that has kind of a historical setting, typically features steam-powered machinery rather than advanced machinery. Mad Max, if you've seen that, is a good example of steampunk. Also, like most the 2010 Sherlock Holmes, things like Wild Wild West. These are all good examples of steampunk. Can you take a second and write down our terms and definitions for both cyberpunk and steampunk now? All right, welcome back. Hey, we've got one more punk in this, and this is the concept of solar punk. Let me show you a couple of examples here. So much like Afrofuturism, solar punk is going to envision a type of world where we have really kind of figured out the climate crisis, right? It's a hopeful space. Our technical definition is a literary genre and art movement that envisions how the future might look if humanity succeeded in solving major contemporary challenges, with an emphasis on sustainability, human impact on the environment, climate change, and pollution. You looked at a world a little bit ago, one of our first activities where we described like what might this look like, sound like, smell like, that arguably could have been out of a solar punk kind of aesthetic to it. Take a moment and write down our definition for solar punk now. Come up with a related image, something solar punk aesthetic, maybe even an example. And last but not least in the categories here is space opera. So this might not be a term that you're familiar with, but you definitely are familiar with some of the examples. So, space operas are sci-fi stories that take place over many years or generations, using a whole host of characters and often ending up across different planets, like Star Wars. That's a space opera, right? Battlestar Galactica, that's a space opera. You could potentially argue that the Avengers is a space opera as well. It kind of creates a cinematic universe there. Star Trek, all of these really overarching long theme, almost like a soap opera, but it's a space opera. Can you go ahead and write down our term and definition for space opera now? All right, one more left, courtesy of one of your classmates. This is the term speculative zoology. You know who you are. Thank you for this term. So there's kind of two different ways that speculative zoology can play out, but let's take a look at the words themselves first. First, this word speculative. One of your terms from last class was speculative fiction, right? Which encompasses sci-fi, but also things like fantasy or even historical fiction or horror. This idea of kind of guessing or speculating at what will come. And the second word in our term here is zoology. Now, the part of this that might sound familiar, or maybe the whole word does, is zoo, right? Think animals. So when we put these two things together, we're looking at hypothetical evolutions of animals, what animals could turn into, or we're looking at straight up fictional animals. As you go about creating your worlds and your kind of settings, your rules, you could also go about creating maybe some animals. Could you evolve a giraffe that also looks a bit like a pelican? Or an alien that has evolved from a lizard or from a bird? Or you could go to bring us back to our space opera here. You look at all of the animals, the background animals in Star Wars movies. These are all fantastic examples of speculative zoology. Can you take a moment and write down our definition and maybe have some fun coming up with an example or finding a related image now? All right, that's what I've got for you. See you in class.